Hi everyone, I'm Izzy and I'm the co-founder here at Kind Community, and this is the Kind Community Show. We share stories of founders, activists, and influencers promoting positivity and protection of our planet, discussing how collaboration can help make the sustainable attainable. On today's episode, we have Tyla Lockwood, a sustainable advocate, speaker, educator, and podcast host based in Australia. Tyla's goal is to share with the world that living your best life doesn't need to come at the cost of the planet. She is the host and founder of the Unlock Earth podcast, where she combines recent research, special guests, and her own experiences to provide unique perspectives and interesting discussions. In today's episode, we'll learn a bit more about Tyla's journey into sustainability, discuss how to turn agency into action, and how we can maximize our lives whilst minimizing our impact to the planet. Tyla, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I guess for context, it'd be great to kind of share how we met. And we didn't physically meet ever, but we met on an app called Clubhouse. So it would just be really interesting to know, are you still on Clubhouse? And how has that kind of helped your mission of being on Clubhouse and making those connections?
So if I'm being 100% honest, I still do have a little bit of Clubhouse burnout. So I haven't been as active on the app for the last little while. But I mean, at the very beginning of it, it was incredible to connect with so many people, both in Australia and overseas, who just have the same passions and love sustainability. And I feel like there was a really clear way that people were kind of finding people that had their same niche, whether that was sustainable travel or sustainable fashion or sustainable architecture. Like there was kind of everything on there. So it was a really great way to connect with people. And obviously I was able to connect with you, which was an absolute highlight. But yeah, it was just such a beautiful place that brought a lot of people together. So I think maybe after this, I'll have to get back on it and do the stuff that I should have been doing the last few months. Have just been a little bit burnt out from it because I enjoyed it so much at the beginning.
Yeah, you definitely find yourself being on there for hours and not even noticing, but it's great for connections. We're really glad that we got to meet you on the app. So tell us a bit more about your journey into sustainability. So you graduated uni with a bachelor's of business management and marketing. So were you always kind of interested in sustainability? What really got you to kind of start what you started with Unlock Earth?
Yeah. So, I mean, I finished university just like in January of 2020, and that was just before the pandemic started. Right. So it was kind of really, I did have like a very big sort of epiphany moment where I was traveling. I finished university and pretty much the next day I jumped on a plane to the US to do some Taekwondo competitions. I was competing in Taekwondo at the time. So I was in the US doing some training and competing. And I had a day to myself after 4 almost nonstop years of university and working, and just I didn't have time in my life at that point to kind of just have space. And so I was in Washington, D.C. I was by myself. The people I was traveling with went to an outlet mall, and I just had the day to explore by myself. I had no expectations, all the space in the world. And I was walking around going, oh my God, I'm alive. Like this is life. And I just had this moment of, I haven't felt like this in at least the last 4 years since I finished high school, and I can't do that for the rest of my life. Otherwise, I'm not truly living. So from that moment, I really started to think about the type of lifestyle I wanted. And from there, I kind of got a lot of clarity around my values. And a big one of those was sustainability. And I mean, before then, I was definitely interested in it. But literally that day, I went home and wrote a blog post about sustainability. And a couple of days later, we were in a Walmart and there was just plastic all over the shelves. And I'd already kind of been starting in the sort of low waste living space. And so just seeing all that plastic really affirmed that for me. And went and wrote another blog post. And from there, it kind of spiraled and everything happened after that. At first, I had launched everything as Unlock Earth, the Unlock Earth podcast. Everything was under that umbrella. And then I kind of felt like I wanted it to connect more with me personally, and that a lot of these things were kind of my personal opinions. I didn't kind of need it to be this big brand outside of me. I wanted people to be able to connect with me, and it felt a bit more authentic. So, I mean, the podcast is still the Unlock Earth podcast and it will remain that way, but I kind of put everything else under my personal name. And yeah, I guess the rest is history. From there, it's kind of spiraled into speaking engagements. Like I said, the podcast, I said before we started on this that I need to get the YouTube channel back up and running after a few months. So yeah, it's kind of just gone from there. And really, I mean, doing a business and marketing degree, coming out of that, I always thought I was going to work in a big FMCG or fast moving consumer goods company, like a big beauty company. And it didn't take long for me to realize that that just didn't align with my vision of a sustainable future. And it was just so wasteful. So that was sort of when I decided to not go down that path and do something different. And that has led me to here today talking to you.
No, you took your life into your own hands. That's really great. And talking about your YouTube channel, I did a bit of digging, of course. And in your first video, I think you mentioned that you wanted to make the world a better place. And I just want to understand, what does that world look like to you? And how do you hope to achieve that with what you're doing with Unlock Earth?
I think it's almost hard to put into words sort of what the future that I would love to see would look like, because so many of the systems that we have in place now are perpetuating a lot of the cycles that I think need to end. And I think the beauty of the sustainability community is that it's opened my eyes up to the fact that it's just so much more than just making sure our waterways aren't polluted and making sure that we have nice beaches and fresh air. And it's so systemic and it impacts every issue in the world. And I think that and I guess that's why a lot of people talk about intersectionality when it comes to sustainability, because so many social issues are all interconnected and you can't really fix one without fixing the other. So I think the future that I see is just a place that is equitable and safe for every human to live and be themselves. And I think a big part of that is having a planet that's going to be able to sustain us. And at this point, at the rate we're going, that's just not going to happen. And so I think that if we're not going to see the big action that we want from places like our governments or corporations, then that's something that I feel like we need to all take on ourselves. And I'm not saying that means everyone has to make huge changes, but I think it's the small changes that make a difference. And yeah, I think the futures that I would love to see for us is really hard to put into words, because like I said, I think it would be so different from the way we live now that it is exciting, but it's also very scary. And it just shows there's so much work to be done across the board. Because like I said, at the end of the day, while sustainability is where I find so much of my passion from, by no means is it an isolated topic. And there are so many issues around it that need to be tackled at the same time.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's a symptom of many broken systems that we need to address. And, talking about challenges, what were some of the challenges you faced? So you went to DC, you started writing these blogs. Was there any pushback from maybe even your family members, or like, what are you doing? You need to get a job. You can't be doing this. Or even just not knowing actually where to start. So what were some of those challenges like, and how did you overcome them?
I feel like I went through like the stages of grief with trying to work out what I wanted to do. Because like I said, I had this like vision of like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. A big part of that was travel. And then we went into lockdown. So straight away I was at this point of like, okay, I can, what we thought was going to be like 3 months. I was like, I can wait for 3 months before doing anything, or I can go home, do my 2 weeks of quarantine that I had to do coming back I was at Europe at the time. I went to Europe after being in the US. Came back home, did my 2 weeks of quarantine and was like, great, what am I going to do now? So from there, it really became, I think everything that you said was really a challenge for me. I mean, when I first started trying to understand exactly what I wanted to do, because I'm very much someone who's like, I'm going to do everything. And then it's like, well, I'm not going to be able to do everything. And so, I mean, the podcast for me was something that made a lot of sense. I was always someone who was told that I talk too much. So I was like, I might as well make it into a podcast. But I think that was a really big one, was kind of working out what I wanted to do. And that's still to this day something that I struggle with, trying to just work out exactly where I want to put my resources and what I want to do. And so a big part for me is just working out what are my values and what kind of most aligns to that. So a big one is freedom and being able to kind of work my own hours and do those sorts of things. So what around me can I set up so that can happen? Other than that, I mean, I was so nervous at first when I was kind of posting. I was posting by myself. I think my brother might have been the only person who knew about it, and he kind of, I think, might have stumbled across it on accident. And from there, I decided to share it on my personal socials. And I was so nervous about people seeing just the Instagram page, even the website, anything like that. And I realized very quickly that people don't care what you're doing. Like, people were so supportive. Like, don't get me wrong, people were so supportive. But at the end of the day, no one's looking at you being like, oh, what an idiot for doing that. Like, no one cares. And if they do care, then that says a hell of a lot more about them than it does about you. So that was another big lesson for me to learn. And I think to this day, I do have the moment of like, what are other people going to think? Yeah. And so I always just remind myself, like, doesn't matter. This is my life. At the end of the day, the only person I have to answer to is myself. And if I've done something that I think is negative, but it's only impacted me, then I'm like, all right, well, let's talk about that. Let's think through that. It doesn't have to involve other people. So I think those were the two major things, was kind of putting myself out there. And I guess the other one as well is feeling like I didn't know enough to talk about stuff. And I think there's like this perception that you have to know everything about everything to talk about it. And I mean, sustainability is such an enormous topic, and it's so nuanced and it's so detailed. And I mean, I learn things every single day about it that I didn't know the day before that truly shocked me. And so I think it's kind of, I've had to become okay with maybe being a hypocrite sometimes. So sometimes I'll say something and then I'll have to come back 2 months later and be like, you know what I said then? I'm sorry, that was wrong. And this is how I've tried to kind of rectify that. And I'm not talking huge things. I'm talking like, I thought this was better than it actually is, or this brand that I previously thought was great, I've done some research and it's mostly greenwashing. So I think that just being able to be like, it's okay to not know everything, to put yourself out there. And if one small tip that I give someone helps, then that's all that matters. I don't need to be an expert in sustainability. I don't need to have all the degrees in the world to be able to talk on this and put myself out there. So yeah, those were a few of the biggest challenges I faced. But I mean, every single day I think that I get up and I'm like, oh, I could just go work in a 9 to 5 and not care.
Sure.
But I can't. And I do. There are days where I'm like, I wish I didn't care about anything, because it's harder to care. And so that's kind of an ongoing battle as well.
No, definitely. I think there's a lot to learn from that. As you said, it's kind of putting yourself out there and just taking that first step and doing it, just putting it out there and doing it for yourself and not anybody else. And then that transparency piece of owning that you may not know everything. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, because you'll be more open to collaboration and learning from others. So I think that's great. You talk a lot about mindsets and how living a more eco-conscious lifestyle sometimes is just a mindset change, and not to take that lightly, but it's really about mindset. And I was curious to know, how did you kind of turn your agency into action early on, and what tips would you have for others to do the same?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, our mind is so powerful. Whatever we think is what is reality, right? So if we see something a certain way, then that's the way it's going to be to us. And so when people see sustainability as this huge out of reach thing that they could never, or sustainable living, I guess, is this thing that they could never participate in because it's too hard or it's too expensive or it takes too much time, then that's going to be the reality for them. It is going to be too hard, it is going to be too expensive, and it is going to take too much time. So I think if we can get in a mindset of really knowing that it doesn't take, like, the world doesn't need everyone doing everything perfectly. That's not what the goal is. The goal is for us to all make changes that we can do within our own ability. And that's going to be different for everyone. And so I think mindset wise, I mean, there's so many different ways that you can kind of approach mindset and how mindset influences sustainability. But even just looking at your everyday habits and questioning why you do things, so much of what we do is a habit. And Gretchen Rubin, who's one of my favorite authors, she has a book called Better Than Before. And it's all about how to create and break habits. And I really, really recommend that to anyone who wants to help build more habits. But a lot of the stuff that she writes in her book is stuff that I was able to implement. So pairing is a great example that she has in her book, where you pair one thing that maybe you don't want to do with one thing you do want to do. So for example, if you love listening to podcasts like I do, but you never really have time for it, maybe try walking to your supermarket and listen to your podcast at the same time. So that way it makes the walk seem quicker. You're not driving, which is better. If this is possible for you, it's obviously not going to be possible for everyone. But by pairing podcasting and walking, it means you're probably way more encouraged to walk places than you aren't. And obviously that's if you love podcasts. Whatever it is going to kind of work for different people. But there are so many things like that in our everyday lives where we just jump in the car and don't think about the fact that we could probably walk somewhere, or we buy something off of our favorite website because it's on sale without thinking, okay, do I really need this? Like, is this bringing me enough value to really take that step? So mindset wise to me comes a couple of different ways. And I guess the biggest change that, mindset change that really affected me personally and made me kind of go into action was really just realizing that I have an impact on the planet. And for me, that was through low waste living, because I think it's one of the most visual ways you see your impact. Like if you think about every time you put your rubbish out, however you do that, wherever you live, I mean, for us, it's just you pop your bin out on the street, gets picked up once or twice or once every week or once every fortnight. If the bin gets picked up, think about that times 52 weeks in a year if your bin's getting picked up every week. Like that's just you and that's just your waste. And so for me, that was such a visual thing to be like, oh my gosh, like that is a lot of waste and I'm one human. And I do live in a household of 4 people. So yes, it might be a bit more than my individual impact, but it just made a huge, it made me have a big realization of, okay, I have an impact to make. And that was a big mindset shift. And because if I have impact, that means I also am able to change that impact. So yeah, that was probably my biggest mindset shift. And that was probably the biggest thing that kicked me into action. And like I said, low waste living was probably my sort of segue into sustainability as a whole, because once I realized the issues with waste, I realized the issues with kind of everything else. So yeah, I think if you're kind of struggling to realize that your impact or really kind of come to terms with it, or you want to have a bit of a shock, sometimes people want that bit of a shock, look at your bin, look at how much waste you produce in a week, times that by 52, and then think you're one of 7 billion humans. So that's just, to me, that like blew my mind. And again, not every human is making nearly as much waste, which is also something to consider, because if you think that if you're listening to this show on a device, then you're probably producing more waste and contributing more to climate change, but you're going to have less of an impact, which as well is a reason why I always feel so drawn to change, was when I realized that I'm more likely to contribute to it, but less likely to face the consequences. So I felt it was almost like my duty to make a change in my own life, however I could. And for everyone, it's not going to be the same, as I said, but I think we can all, there's space for every one of us to make a change, make a difference, big or small.
Oh, definitely. I honestly couldn't agree more. And I think it could start with the education piece. It's really learning and putting things into perspective in your own lives. I like the idea of habits. I think that's a big one as well. But to be fair, so when you're saying, like, when you put things into perspective around like the bins, right? Like that to me makes me it stresses me out sometimes. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's insane. And I think that's a big issue right now, is around kind of eco-anxiety, and then people shutting down in the face of climate change because they just feel like they don't have, like they wouldn't be able to make an impact just themselves. So I'm curious to know, how do you kind of keep your mental well-being, in check at the face of the crisis, so that you don't feel like, you're shutting down in the face of it?
Yeah, I am the biggest mental health advocate. Like, I think everyone needs to prioritize their mental health. And that's a big part of, you mentioned my kind of slogan earlier is like, living your best life doesn't need to come at the cost of the planet. Because I think at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to do the best thing for the planet if you're not looking after yourself. So for example, I'm in quarantine at the moment. So my mental health over the last 2 weeks has not been the best. And that means I haven't been making the best decisions. And so I think that if you don't look after your mental health, then you're not going to be able to look after those other areas. So I mean, for me personally, a lot of it is around getting professional help. I know it's not available to everyone. I'm really lucky to live in a country where it's more accessible, but even then it's definitely not free. So I think if you are able to see a professional for any area in your life, because at the end of the day, while you might have a lot of anxiety and stress towards climate change, it's probably in all areas of your life as well. For me, journaling is another really, really great way to kind of clear my head and clear my mind and just refocus into what's really important. And there's often just too much going on in my head. I need to get it down on paper, and that's a really great way to do that. Exercise, as much as I kind of hate to do it, is definitely something that gets that sort of anxiety, stress off. And then just remembering that I can only do what I can do, and that no one's perfect. And at the end of the day, the reason that we have so many of these habits and so many of these things that we do, like our shopping habits, where we go grocery shopping, stuff like that, is that's what's available to us. So at the end of the day, while I do encourage individual impact, I do think there is so much space for individual change and individual action. We also have to be aware of the way that our society is set up. And I think there's definitely being change and movement towards sort of more sustainable options, more waste-free options, more sort of renewable energy options. At the end of the day, we're humans trying to get through this planet, and if this is what's available to us, then that's okay. And if for you that means that maybe a lot of my tips don't work, then please let me know where else I can help you. Like, those are the sorts of things that I think are really important, because I come at this from my point of view, and I am probably missing things that so many other people are like, oh, I could never do that. But in my head, I'm like, oh, that's easy to do. And so I think that that's why it's so important to have so many voices talking about sustainability. And so many of the accounts that I follow are very different to me. They live in different countries, they're from different areas, all that sort of thing. So I can get that perspective and get that understanding as well. But back to your original question, I think at the end of the day, just remembering that you can only do what you can do, giving yourself some break, and just remembering that every small action you make is something that you didn't have to do. And so if you're able to do that, then that's huge and that's awesome. And I mean, we're all doing this because we're in the hopes of a better future. So just think of that better future that we're hopefully moving towards as well.
Yeah, no, I love that. Going back to your slogan, where living your best life doesn't need to come at the cost of the planet. How has that message landed with your audience? And what do you think is the hardest thing to overcome when starting this journey in sustainability? Is it, the food that people are eating? Is it consumption? What do you think is the hardest to overcome?
I think for everyone, it's so different. And I think the reason that my message has landed with people, and the people that have reached out to me, which I love seeing because it means I know that I'm kind of on the right track. A lot of people are saying that, like, it's a relief, because it's like, okay, so I don't have to change my whole life and do all this stuff that I don't want to do just for this one thing. Like, people have been like, well, I've reduced all the waste in my bathroom, but I just love this one croissant package or something, or croissant that comes in a package, like something like that. I'm like, then eat the croissant. Or people who are like, oh, I can't go completely vegan. It's like, I love cheese. I'm like, you don't have to go completely vegan. Like, eat the cheese if that's what you want. I'm definitely not vegan, and that's a big area that I'm trying to work on. And I just think in general, there's so much of our life is going to have an impact no matter what we do. No matter if you live as kind of close to the earth as possible, you are going to have an impact, which is why I think it is so important to do the things you love. If that means that you love to buy fashion pieces that make you feel incredible, then do that. But just think about what you're doing before you do it. And I think that that's where sort of the mindset consciousness piece comes in. Like, if you're conscious of what you're doing and you're not just consuming aimlessly, then that's already a huge step forward. And so I think that when we talk about sort of the biggest challenge areas, like I said, it's going to be different for everyone. And a lot of the time it's just the stuff that's inbuilt habits. For some people, when they're trying to overcome stress, they go shopping online. That was definitely something I probably used to do. And since then, I've been able to change that sort of mindset around that's what makes me feel better, and find other things that do. And again, no one's going to be perfect at this. And if people are showing you online that they are, then that's awesome. But just take what works for you and leave what doesn't.
No, definitely. And not shaming others for, taking their first few steps and being imperfect in the space.
Exactly.
Let's talk about kind of advocacy and activism. So you identify as an advocate, and I would love to know how you define advocacy versus activism. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Can you be one and the other? I just want to, just if you could shed a bit more light on why you identify as an advocate versus an activist.
Yeah, so it was something that I honestly at first didn't put a lot of thought into. And so when I was kind of reflecting on it, I think I see why people put so much emphasis on it. Like I said, for me personally, when I first started, I was like, oh, I'm an advocate. That kind of fits. I like that. Let's go with that. And so the more I've kind of reflected and thought on it, I've kind of, from what my perspective is, and obviously people are going to have different opinions, and I would love to hear from people if they do have opposing opinions to this, but activism is really action-oriented. It's often kind of working out. Did I say activism? I meant activism. If I didn't. Yeah, activism, yeah. Activism is kind of, very action-oriented. It's kind of in the word activism, action-oriented. And the reason I think that is because you're kind of working outside the system. You're looking at sort of, and again, this is from my point of view, you're looking at these bigger systematic changes, which are so important. For me, when it comes to advocacy, it's more people-oriented. So you're kind of focusing on what people can do and sharing that voice. For me, a lot of my advocacy work is through sharing other creators and other sustainability advocates or activists on my podcast. So raising up others' voices as well is a big part of advocacy for me. It's really the reason I kind of choose advocate over activist is because I'm kind of working within the existing system to help people make change. I do think that longer term and in the future, I could definitely see myself moving into more of a activist role and kind of looking for that bigger systematic change, which I think is so important. But for right now, I see my place as helping people along that journey, sharing information and supporting people through that journey rather than trying to make this bigger systematic change. And I think they're both so important because you kind of don't, if you don't have the advocates there kind of sharing the message and encouraging people to action, then by the time there's change from the activists, are people really going to be ready for that? So from my point of view, you kind of need both of them. There's definitely a place for both of them. And if you identify as an advocate or an activist and you kind of sit outside that definition, then that's completely okay. Like that's the way I view it. Everyone else is going to view it in a slightly different way. But I really see there's a place for both. And I think you could be both. And I think that I sort of foresee in the future, after doing the work on helping people in their individual lives, the systematic change needs to happen for long-term difference. So I think that that's probably where I will move into. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's just people working for change. And I mean, it definitely means different things as well if you're talking about different sectors. So if you're talking about like a social justice activist versus a sustainability activist, while a lot of that stuff does cross over, the way that they approach things is going to be very, very different. So that's just my point of view as well. I would love to hear if anyone after this show has any opinions. I'd love to hear those as well.
Definitely. Oh no, thanks for sharing that. That's very clear. Thank you for sharing. Agreed. Would love to hear other people's perspectives on that. So finally, Tyla, what are you most hopeful for? And what keeps you up at night? Maybe a bit of a loaded question.
This is a great question, actually, I think. So I think hopeful wise and I think they kind of overlap, right? So I think what I'm most hopeful for is just a future where every single person is kind of aware of their impact, whether that's sustainability wise, whether that's in any other way, shape or form. I think that we all have to be aware of our impact, aware of our privilege, and then be doing something to kind of rectify that. And so I think that I'm hopeful that people are starting to realize that. And I do think there's so much change that is happening. I think it's really hard sometimes when you're online talking about sustainability or, for example, I really like TikTok, as I'm sure many people do, and I get really hopeful when I see so much positive content on there, which of course is directed at me because that's what I look at and that's what I follow. At the same time, there is just as much of the opposite of what I want to see. So I'm really hopeful for the change that is starting to be made. I think especially Australia is a place that, which obviously I live in currently, is a place that there's starting to be this real awareness of our planet and how much we need to protect it, purely from the fact that so much of the most recent damaging things that have happened, like we had bushfires in 2019 that were kind of broadcast around the world. And the reason that I think so many people were so moved by that was because it kind of made people realize, like, yes, our climate is changing. These were some of the longest and most severe bushfires that we've ever had. At the same time, exactly. And the other thing that came with that as well, and something that I haven't really mentioned so far that I think is really important, is us adopting more of the practices that were done by Indigenous people before there was colonization. So it's really, I mean, the reason I bring that up is because when it comes to the bushfires, many Australian Indigenous tribes knew how to tackle this. They knew how to make a difference and how to really reduce the impact of bushfires, and we're not following those practices. We're not doing the things that they knew work, they know work, and we just weren't doing them. And so I think that to me as well just really highlighted the importance of us raising up Indigenous voices and making sure that these kind of old, like these ancient techniques are carried through to this generation and done in a way that's both respectful but is utilizing this knowledge that they have. Like, they knew the land way better than we ever will. So that was something that made me really hopeful. It was like an awful, awful thing that happened, and it was so devastating for animals, it was devastating for people, it was devastating for the earth, but it made me hopeful seeing the reaction after that and seeing that people were kind of finally like, okay, this is different to what we've seen before. Australia almost always has bushfire, like every year we'll have bushfires, not to that extent and not to that severity. So that's sort of what I'm hopeful for. what keeps me up at night is kind of the other side of the spoon, which was seeing sort of the government reaction to it. And it really concerns me the amount of globally we are starting to see government action. And again, that this is something that relates mostly to in Australia. Our government pretty much doesn't believe in climate change. Like our Prime Minister brought a block of coal to Parliament and was like, this is our future. And so that keeps me up at night thinking about the fact that there are still so many people out there that have that belief system and that they are in positions of power. And as well, a lot of the sort of connections that oil and gas and a lot of the most damaging industries have to government. And that's a tie that isn't easily broken. So that worries me for the future. But at the same time, starting to see the action and the impact of people around us and people around like just the regular folks, like anyone else who isn't kind of in those big, powerful positions, realizing that they can make change. That's what makes me hopeful. The other side of it is that everyone else keeps me up at night. So it is kind of the same. It is the same coin. It's two sides of the same coin. And I do think that there's definitely going to be change in the future. And I'm very, very hopeful for that. I just hope it happens as quickly as it needs to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, you want to be optimistic, but there's still a lot to get done.
Exactly.
All right, now it's time for a quick fire round, Tyla.
Oh, I'm excited.
Are you ready?
I am.
Great. So how do you define sustainability?
Oh, in a quick fire round? Okay.
Yeah.
To me, sustainability is not taking more from the earth than the earth can give us. So living within the confinements of the earth and putting back into it. So yeah, I'm trying to not make this too long.
No, that's perfect.
Okay, we'll leave it there.
Okay. What's your favorite sustainability hack? There's probably many of them.
Oh, there are so many. Okay, here's one that I've reaffirmed recently is that if you're going to travel, which I'm a big advocate of sustainable travel, so that's why I say travel, bar products make traveling so much easier. You don't have to worry about it leaking. Shampoo, conditioner, cleansers, soap, all can be in bar products. And like I said, at the moment, I'm interstate, so much easier to travel. I can't stress that enough. So if you're not on the bar products yet and you like to travel, give some bar shampoo and conditioners a go. It comes in way less packaging and no plastics.
I'm yet to find a good conditioner bar, so if anybody has any suggestions, please feel free to send them my way. And what are some of your favorite channels / profiles to learn about living a more sustainable life?
There's so many. Obviously, Kind Community is a great place to start for anyone who wants to find out more. There are so many. I mean, I've recently interviewed Isaiah from the Queer Brown Vegan, who just is an incredible person. I haven't yet put out that podcast episode, so that's coming very soon. Just love everything that they do. The Plastic Free Mermaid here in Australia, she was one of the first people that I followed around plastic free living, so that's also a great resource. I really like Earthrise. I really like what they're doing. There's so many. I could list so many more. Those were the ones that were off the top of my head. There are some great ones both here in Australia and globally. So, I mean, if you look at anyone who I'm following, they're probably a good place to start.
Exactly. Just do some creeping on your socials.
Exactly. Yeah. Creep all you want. I give you
Well, thank you so much, Tyla, for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you and learning more about what you're doing in this space. Can you let everybody know where to find you? Yeah,
of course. So my website is tylalockwood.com. Should be pretty easy to find. Everything else is pretty much just Tyla Lockwood, and my podcast is the Unlock Earth podcast. So if you search that on any of your favorite podcasting websites, or it's linked on my website, my Instagram, all of that good stuff. So yeah, pretty much just search my name, Tyla Lockwood, and you'll find anything that you need to find.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much again, Tyla, for joining us today. We'll speak soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Bye.
See ya.
If you enjoyed my conversation with Tyla today, please do share, like, and subscribe for more conversations. We go live every Friday and very much look forward to having you join us next week. Have a great weekend.